day 1034 of the Trump administration, and the latest round of public impeachment hearings wrap up just a short time ago, actually. It was a marathon day. The questioning was relentless again today. It will be again tomorrow. 4 witnesses testified for nearly 10 hours before the House Intel Committee about what they knew about President Trump's request to Ukraine's president to investigate Democratic political rivals. The day was divided into 2 sessions. The first set of witnesses saw Jennifer Williams, a State Department employee, detailed to Vice President Pence's office on Eurasia matters, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the lead Ukraine expert on the White House National Security Council. The afternoon session heard from 2 officials the Republican side called as witnesses: Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine and the peace talks there, and Tim Morrison, a senior NSC official overseeing Russia and Europe policy. Morrison was on that July 25th call with Ukraine's president. He resigned in October. Volker provided one of the hearing's big unexpected moments when he amended his closed-door testimony and acknowledged others had laid out conditions to Ukraine for releasing military aid.
At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden. I was not on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. I was not made aware of any reference to Vice President Biden or his son by President Trump. Until the transcript of that call was released, I did not know that President Trump or others had raised Vice President Biden with the Ukrainians, or had conflated the investigation of possible Ukrainian corruption with investigation of the former vice president. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden.
Not long after that moment, former National Security official Tim Morrison gave what may be the clearest outline of quid pro quo heard so far. It came during this exchange when Morrison was asked to recall a September 1st conversation between U.S. Ambassador to the EU Gordon Sondland and Ukraine government official Andriy Yermak.
What did Ambassador Sondland say to tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the prosecutor general make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
As you may know, this scandal has also been branded missiles for misinformation. The president's personal lawyer and his influence on Trump's thinking on Ukraine was also discussed. Here's what Ambassador Volker said Trump told him.
He said that Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said they tried to take me down. President Trump had a deeply rooted negative view on Ukraine rooted in the past. He was receiving other information from other sources, including Mayor Giuliani, that was more negative, causing him to retain this negative view.
The day began with testimony from those 2 other White House officials, Jennifer Williams, an aide to Pence, and National Security official, U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. Both of them listened in on that July 25th Trump-Ukraine call. Both testified about their concerns.
I found the July 25th phone call unusual because, in contrast to other presidential calls I had observed, it involved discussion of what appeared to be a domestic political matter.
It was inappropriate. It was improper for the president to request and to demand an investigation.
The references to specific individuals and investigations, such as former Vice President Biden and his son, struck me as political in nature, given that the former vice president is a political opponent of the president.
The witnesses were also asked about what was and what was not mentioned in that White House summary of the phone call.
Both of you recall President Zelensky in that conversation raising the issue or mentioning Burisma, do you not?
That's correct.
Correct.
And yet the word Burisma appears nowhere in the call record that's been released to the public. Is that right?
That's right.
Correct.
Reminder, we have not seen a transcript. What's been released is a summary of the phone call. House Republicans tried to refocus the morning session by pressing Vindman on his conversations that followed the call with a line of questioning the committee chairman quickly shut down.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, did you discuss the July 25th phone call with anyone outside the White House on July 25th or the 26th? And if so, with whom?
I spoke to two individuals with regards to providing some sort of readout of the call. Not in the White House, cleared U.S. government officials with appropriate need to know.
And what agencies were these officials with?
Department of State, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, who is responsible for the portfolio Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, and an individual from the office of an individual in the intelligence community.
What agency was this individual from?
If I could interject here, we don't want to use these proceedings.
It's our time,
I know,
Mr. Chair.
but we need to protect the whistleblower.
Please stop.
That exchange, that interruption, was followed by a rather tense correction.
Mr. Vindman, you testified in your deposition that you did not know the whistleblower.
Ranking member, it's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, please.
There were also attempts to call Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's loyalty into question. The Iraq War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, came to the U.S. as a young boy after his family fled the Soviet Union. During the hearing, he was asked about repeated job offers he'd received from the director of Ukraine's National Security Council.
Did Mr. Daniluk offer you a position of defense minister with the Ukrainian government?
He did.
And how many times did he do that?
I believe it was 3 times.
And do you have any reason why he asked you to do that?
I don't know, but every single time I dismissed it. Upon returning, I notified my chain of command and the appropriate counterintelligence folks about the offer.
Multiple right-wing conspiracy theorists, including Rudy Giuliani, have accused you of harboring loyalty towards Ukraine. They've accused you of espionage and dual loyalties. We've seen that in this room this morning. The 3 minutes that were spent asking you about the offer made to make you the Minister of Defense, that may have come cloaked in a Brooks Brothers suit and in parliamentary language, but that was designed exclusively to give the right-wing media an opening to question your loyalties.
We should note, in light of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman now being in the public eye and under criticism, the U.S. Army tells NBC News it's working with civilian authorities to ensure that he and his family are properly protected. That could include moving them from their home if need be. As he was testifying, the president was holding a cabinet meeting and complaining about this inquiry.
And I just got to watch, and the Republicans are absolutely killing it. They are doing so well because it's a scam. It's a big scam.
One more thing here. The House did act on a piece of business today. Lawmakers passed a short-term funding bill today to try to avert a government shutdown and keep our government open until December 20th. That would be 5 days before Christmas. What could go wrong? The bill now moves on to the U.S. Senate. But back to our lead story. Let's bring in our guest to start us off on this Tuesday night. Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon, notably former chief counsel to that very committee we've been watching, House Intelligence. Elizabeth Bumiller, the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, and Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press. Good evening and welcome to all of you. Jeremy Bash, I'd like to begin with you. What was it we witnessed today? What have we learned after today?
Well, the record is building, Brian. Here you have 4 Trump appointees who bucked the official directive of the administration, which is to stonewall Congress. And they came forward and they confirmed the essential facts as we know, which is that the president of the United States demanded that a foreign leader try to help him rig the 2020 election. And although the state of the Republican defense is a little bit in disarray as they sort of grope around for what the right theory of their case is, where they're mostly going is to say we're a year out from an election, so let's let the voters decide, except the very heart of this case is that the president was trying to rig that election. and trying to undermine national security in so doing. And so I think today was a day that advanced the narrative and the factual record. And tomorrow, of course, we'll hear from a very important witness who was really at the center of this quid pro quo, the deal to require the investigation in exchange for the military aid.
And Jeremy, quickly, what about these attacks, glancing and direct, on an active duty U.S. Army lieutenant colonel?
Oh, it wasn't even subtle, Brian. It was, quite frankly, disgusting. I mean, here's a guy who was wounded in combat, has served his country for 20 plus years. All of his brothers have served. His dad took the family out of the Soviet Union so they could be free, so they could speak truth to power, so they could speak openly about truth and facts. And here we have some people on the dais and some people in the media claiming that he's a Soviet traitor, someone who's not really in the Army. I mean, I think all military families and the entire chain of command should stand up and say whether or not you agree with him or not, get off his back and let the guy live and testify in safety.
Elizabeth, at the end of each day, your job is to decide the package of coverage your newspaper runs from your bureau in Washington. Nothing could be more important right about now. How did you begin that task late today? How do you possibly headline what we witnessed all day long?
Well, I think the main thing the main news today was that two White House officials said in open testimony that they found the call that President Trump had with the president of Ukraine on July 25th is inappropriate and improper. We certainly had heard that before from their closed-door testimony. This we heard in public. Secondly, perhaps most important story is that the White House turned on its own. We have seen President Trump and the Trump administration. We've seen President Trump turn on his attorney general, turn on the Fed chair, turn on people who've left the White House, like John Bolton. We have never seen the president turn on current White House officials who are going to go to work in the White House complex tomorrow morning. That was a first. And that, again, he did it in real time. And thirdly, I think we saw that Colonel Vindman was very, he wore his uniform. It evoked images of Oliver North from more than 3 decades ago in the Iran-Contra hearings. And the uniform was a symbol and also a bit of a protector for Colonel Vindman to show that I'm an American citizen, I serve my country, and yet he was still open to criticism from the Republicans.
We have a gentleman who used to wear 4 stars on his uniform who's standing by to talk to us on that very topic later in this broadcast. Jonathan Lemire, about the Republicans, did they get what they were looking to get out of today, do you think?
For the most part, I would say the answer is no. Volker and Morrison were Republican witnesses, and Volker in particular sort of played down what the White House and the Trump allies have been saying. He very much defended Joe Biden on the record, said he was a good guy, that he was a public servant, had known him for decades. He said that we heard a little bit of it at the top of the show here, where he outlined the sort of false information the president had been fed on Ukraine. Others believe some of that originates from Vladimir Putin, who, of course, has very negative opinions about Ukraine. And then closer to home, some of the conspiracy theorists, which include Rudy Giuliani. And he really took some swipes at Giuliani, some subtle, some less, suggesting that he was completely misinformed about the situation in Ukraine. Everyone who testified today, they're unanimous in the idea that no one in the national security community thought that the United States should have withheld this military aid from Ukraine. Again, sort of isolating the president and his wishes there, making it clear this was being done for just political purposes. This was not to advance the national interests and security of that part of the world. And this is also, highlighted 2 people who were actually on the call itself, which is an important step as the Democrats build the narrative here of this impeachment. And back to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who, was the subject of most of the attacks from the Republicans today, as they tried to undermine his credibility, as they tried to suggest perhaps that his loyalties laid elsewhere. As Jeremy said, his family took him out of the Soviet Union when he was a child. And he mentioned that at the top of his remarks today. At the end of his prepared opening statement, he said that his father expressed some worry for him, said that, this is the kind of thing, if you were in Russia and you spoke truth to power like this, that you could be in trouble, you could even be killed. And he in a pretty emotional moment, said today in the Capitol, said, Dad, we're in America now. I'm paraphrasing, but Dad, we're in America now. I'm going to be safe. Yet at the same time, We learned the military is looking to perhaps move him and his family to isolated location to safeguard them because perhaps he's not safe. And that's a heartbreaking moment for us all.
Jeremy Bash, I don't know if Mr. Sondland ever played competitive sports or yearned to someday be given the Heisman. He might indeed be getting the Heisman late in his career. The distancing started to begin today in the hearing. In your view, he already had a lot of explaining to do starting tomorrow morning. Did his job get tougher still today?
I think so, because multiple witnesses have now come forward and said they heard him say explicitly that Ukraine would not get the aid unless they conducted the investigations of the Bidens. That was the testimony of Colonel Vindman, who said on July 10th he was in a meeting in the White House during which Gordon Sondland said that. That is what caused Colonel Vindman initially to go to the counsel's office, to go to the lawyer and say, hey, something is really wrong here. And then, of course, Tim Morrison, a Republican congressional staffer who's worked in the Trump White House, he also said that Sondland was tying those two things explicitly together. Now, maybe Sondland will claim tomorrow that he was freelancing, but as we all now know, the president directed Sondland to do it this way, as everybody in that now famous restaurant scene in Ukraine overheard.
And Elizabeth, I want to pick up on something you said in your last answer about the president on social media today. Yes, we heard from him in full in the cabinet room, but I actually heard someone today express pride mixed with surprise that he didn't live tweet the event. However, you view a tweet that attacked a U.S. Army active duty Lieutenant Colonel White House staffer from the White House Twitter account as at least equal to that, correct?
Well, this is the official taxpayer-funded White House Twitter account going out to I don't know how many people. This is, again, another first in the Trump administration. We've never seen something like this before. And I just wanted to talk about Gordon Sondland tomorrow. I think his testimony will be very crucial. He is going to have to explain why he forgot that phone call with the president in that Kiev restaurant last summer. It's just unusual that somebody would forget a phone call with the president. I don't care how many times you talk to the president. So this will be, I think, a pretty dramatic hearing tomorrow.
Jonathan Lemire, we have seconds left, but I wanted to hit you on this final topic. Report in Time magazine, Secretary of State would like to find a graceful exit from Washington, go home to Kansas, run for U.S. Senate. What do you think the real chances are of Mr. Pompeo pulling that off?
This has certainly been widely rumored for a while. Yeah. He has made a number of trips back to Kansas. He has certainly done very little to try to tamp down the speculation that he might want to do this. This comes amid reports of some real increased tension between Pompeo and the president. He's sort of been the president's favorite cabinet member for the most part in recent months. But now, according to some reporting, the president is blaming him for this parade of diplomats and State Department officials who have come up and testified in the impeachment probe. He thinks that Pompeo should have tried to effectively stop that or should have hired different people. Let's remember, most of these are Pompeo hires, including Bill Taylor, who
at least he hasn't defended
who has kicked them off. That's true. I mean, he did not. You're right. He had an opportunity to defend the other day and didn't. As a final note, the State Department tonight has put out a statement saying that this is nothing. That's nothing to this. The secretary is staying in the job. In fact, I believe he's in Brussels right now ahead of some meetings tomorrow. But this is not. This story is not going away anytime soon.
I reckon we'll find out what the people of Kansas feel about it before too long. Jeremy Bash, Elizabeth Buemiller, Jonathan Lemire, our thanks to the three of you at the end of a long day for joining us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.